And I was surprised because this is not something that gets a lot of like popular media coverage, you know, I mean, other than the Colbert Report. And so that was surprising to me, but apparently this is like up and coming area of law because everyone thinks that we're all going to go to the space and we're going to colonize and we're going to extract resources and things like that. So for all of you budding lawyers who deep within your being are like, I'm so going to be a lawyer, you might think about space law because it really does seem to me to be a lucrative career path, and there's a lot of discussion about these current issues. So rights and access to space, this is who gets to go there and who could stay there. Rights and access to space is who's going there and who can stay there. This is particularly an issue on the Moon Treaty, which we'll talk about in a minute. Second key issue in current international law on space is the conduct of commercial transactions. So I don't just mean like when Starbucks, by the way, big Starbucks fan, love it. Do you love Starbucks? Yeah. You should. Seriously. Okay. Anyway, unfortunately, they don't actually give me any credit, but every time I'm in public, I like to give a plug for Starbucks. It's delicious. Triple filtered water and all, it's fabulous. So when Starbucks builds the first orbiting Starbucks, there will be legal implications when I go there, because I will. When I go to the orbiting Starbucks and I buy my first Grande Americano with light ice, there's going to be implications to that commercial transaction, and so a lot of people now are trying to think ahead to when Starbucks makes the floating Starbucks. It's going to be greatness, by the way. They want to think ahead about how they're going to deal with that in terms of international law. Relatedly, the use of space for commercial purposes. Space tourism, have y'all heard that phrase or encountered that in the research that y'all have been doing? Okay. So that's an example of that, or the clip that CT, I think, showed you earlier in the week, where the Russians had lowered the price to $200,000 to like go to space or whatever. Okay, that's an example of that particular issue. Role of government in the use of space relative to other space actors. This is also an important issue. What do you think I mean by that? The role of government's use of space relative to other space actors.
Militarization and like.
Potentially. Yeah, what happens if the U.S. like puts, you know, the Death Star up in space? What is the floating Starbucks going to do if there's like an accidental launch of the Death Star? Yeah. What else? I gave you a hint in just what I said. The other issue is, you know, you've got these entities, like you've got governments that are establishing stuff, either weapons or their own position in space, and then you've got all these private actors, and that's creating a really, really crowded field. It's like the space debris field of international actors. There's like a lot of things going on all at once, and there's a question, on Earth, who trumps everything? Who has the most sovereignty on Earth, or what does? There are many whats of them. Who did we say had sovereignty over their borders on Earth? Countries do, right? And so it's really, really clear to us on Earth, you know, since the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, the world has agreed that, you know, we're going to let states govern the world. Do I have any anarchists out there? Anarchists? Anarchists? All right, then. So anarchists think that we need to get rid of things like that, right? But they're a minority. That is why there are only two, and I would actually not believe them when they say that they're anarchists. Just putting that out there. So we've all kind of come to an agreement. Well, that's not the case in space, right? We don't know who has sovereignty, and there's lots of conflicting ideas about it. All right, liability for any damages created by human use. The Russians launch, you know, some space tourists. The U.S. launches some space tourists, and they like crash into each other on accident. Who's responsible? Who is going to get to file the lawsuit to like get some money and stuff? Domestic interpretation of international commitments. This is a really, really important one. In these international legal agreements, in order to get countries to agree to stuff, everybody has to like make nice with each other, and that doesn't always like happen really easily. And so a lot of times these international agreements are like, hey, U.S., if you agree to this, we'll let you implement it for yourself. Okay? This would be analogous to like if we said to y'all, hey y'all, we will let you implement your dorm check procedures for yourself. You can figure it out for yourself. Go ahead. We're going to get you to agree to come to the workshop, and we're going to tell you that you can figure out dorm check on your own. What do you think is going to happen? What's going to happen then? I think it would be awesome, I'm sure for you. That is outrageous. Is anarchy in the dorm, apparently. Okay, so how did y'all handle that?
Still like that for like an hour or two.
All right, okay. But you did not, like, run from the dorm, right?
No, why?
Well, I mean, you wouldn't have up to it, no? You keep believing that. Yep, absolutely. There's no place to go. No place to go. All right. So if we let you do the dorm check, bed check, room check thing all on your own, what would you likely do? Yeah, you'd sneak out, or you'd sit out in the hallway, or you'd be like, woohoo! Something like that, right? And all of you would probably interpret it differently, right? Some of you deep within your being are like, I follow rules. I will not follow rules. Must follow rules. Must follow the rules. And so you would not participate in the anarchy, but some of you would. Okay? This is exactly what's happening with international agreements right now in space. There are some countries that are like, must follow the rules. We love everyone. Let's sing kumbaya, rainbows, unicorns. It's awesome. And then there are other countries that are like, well, self-defense, or our companies are the best companies, so of course we will interpret things how we want to. And so that's a really important issue when it comes to international laws we'll talk about. All right, Outer Space Treaty of, whatever year that is, 1967. This was even before I was born. This is out, it's craziness. So, by the way, it's well before I was born. All right, so this is the other name for the Treaty on the Principles Governing the Activities of States in blah, 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 blah. If you were using this as a search term, you would not need to know the full name, okay? You just need to know Outer Space Treaty, okay? So, by the way, what does celestial mean? What does it mean, celestial? Yeah, like outer space, in the heavens. All right. Some fundamental ideas behind the Outer Space Treaty. When they negotiated this, what's going on internationally, politically? 1967. The Cold War, exactly. Who were the two sides of the Cold War? Soviet Union and the United States. And have y'all ever heard the phrase First World or Third World?
Yeah.
Okay. So the First World, that term was used to describe countries that lined up with the United States. We now associate it with developed countries, but it really just was who was hanging out with the United States during the Cold War. Second World referred to countries that were lined up with the Soviet Union, and Third World referred to countries which were the countries that the U.S. and the Soviet Union were fighting over. Okay? And so anytime the U.S. and the Soviet Union were like hanging out or dealing with some issue, they were almost always trying to pay attention to whether they could get more countries on their side. Does that make sense to everybody who's not currently doing what I just said not to do, which is copying the rest of the slide down? All right, then. So the United States and the Soviet Union, they got together and they were like, hey, let's negotiate a outer space treaty. When they did that, they knew that everyone was watching them, and they knew that they were focused on whether or not the United States and the Soviet Union had their back. So one of the consequences of that is this first premise of, or provision of the Outer Space Treaty, which is that space is the common heritage of all humans. That's a fundamental premise of the Outer Space Treaty. They said mankind, by the way, that I don't, so I said humans. What do I mean by common heritage?
Everybody's inheritance?
Exactly, it's for like everybody. Have y'all ever talked about Antarctica?
Yeah.
Okay, So Antarctica is this place where like the whole world agreed that we just like leave it be like ice and penguins, and nobody would try to like colonize it or whatever. So now there's just like people doing a bunch of like science experiments there. People applied that. Remember we talked about precedent? People applied what they had experienced with Antarctica when they discovered Antarctica in the early part of the 20th century, and they said, hey, let's do that with space too. And so space is like the new not frozen, and there are no penguins, as far as I know, like Antarctica. The second provision of the Outer Space Treaty, space should be used for peaceful purposes. Because it was the height of the Cold War, they were super concerned that the United States and the Soviet Union, now that they had developed this technology to get to space or put things in space, that they were going to use it to escalate the Cold War. The Outer Space Treaty also holds that space is open to all nations, so that they can have access to resources that are contained in space. This is kind of interesting because obviously like not all countries will actually get to space, but written into the Outer Space Treaty are these ideas that everybody should be able to benefit, and that has actually been pretty controversial in a couple of instances. The last and important thing is that the Outer Space Treaty said that no country could claim sovereignty over space or the stuff in it. No country can claim sovereignty over space or the stuff in it.
But did it say sovereignty when we found the flag on the roof?
No, we were just like, hey, look at us with flag. Yeah. Does that make sense to everybody? Like, we really were just like doing it to like do it as a symbol. We couldn't actually claim sovereignty. Okay, this flaw, there's a flaw-ish in the way that we have approached this a little bit, and that is that the lack of sovereignty claims made by governments, like that governments can't make it. The Outer Space Treaty didn't say anything about companies. So it's like a loophole. You can, if you're a company at this time, you can actually go and claim some sovereignty. We'll talk about why that's important here in just a second. By the way, the Outer Space Treaty is also the pillars of the other 4 agreements that we're going to talk about. All right, the next important provision of the Outer Space Treaty, and obviously, like, don't try to copy this down. The governments get to control implementation. And this was the point that I was making in plenty of seats. Plenty of seats. The government gets to control implementation. This was the thing that I was talking about earlier, where with the dorm bed check. Make sense? So the governments are the ones that actually get to do it. And that's the language that's actually in Article 6 of the treaty, that the activities of non-governmental entities in outer space, including the moon and other celestial bodies, shall require authorization and continuing supervision by parties to the treaty, and that just means the government. So the Outer Space Treaty tried to set this framework and then allow the governments to actually implement it. We'll talk about this a little bit more when we talk about the apps and negs. This gave the United States the ability to establish laws over companies that sought to use space. This gave the United States the ability to establish laws over companies that want to go to space. I'm going to talk just briefly about a couple of these laws. Does everyone get this idea that U.S. signs the treaty and then the U.S. gets to like do what it wants with the treaty? Does everyone get that? Okay. So one of the things that it did was, what we were talking about earlier, it extends maritime and territorial jurisdiction. What's the word jurisdiction? That also means like area of control where you get to like do stuff. So basically this code, by the way, USC means United States Code. That's just another way to think about or label laws. Okay? By the way, some of you are like this. Are you ready? Look at me. You're like, at all of the like text that's up there. So note taking advice. Instead of trying to like copy all of that down, because that doesn't actually help you to get the idea, listen to me as we talk about what these laws are about and then take notes on that. Does that make sense? All right. So this particular code that the U.S., that 8 U.S. Code 76, just a fancy way to